The morning my father was told he wasn't welcome in my own neighborhood, I learned something that had nothing to do with HOA rules and everything to do with people who mistake borrowed authority for permanent power. 3 weeks later, the same woman who smiled while denying my family was standing outside the community clubhouse holding an envelope with trembling hands, realizing she had just lost everything she thought she controlled. Funny how quickly the word welcome can change owners. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I'm 38 years old. I run a software infrastructure company outside Scottsdale, Arizona, and if you met me at the grocery store, you'd probably assume I was just another guy wearing sneakers and buying too much coffee. That's exactly how I like it. Success gave me options, not a need to impress strangers. My wife, Rachel, always jokes that if someone didn't know me, they'd think I worked remotely for somebody else's startup because I still drive the same pickup I've owned for almost 8 years. We moved into our neighborhood because it felt peaceful, safe, and close enough for our 8-year-old son, Noah, to ride his bike without us worrying every 5 minutes. We leased the house through a family investment trust for privacy reasons, something our attorney had recommended years earlier after my company started growing faster than I expected. It never crossed my mind that the word tenant would someday become ammunition in someone else's personal crusade. Every spring, my father flies in from New Mexico and stays with us for about a month. He's 71 now, slower than he used to be, but still the kind of man who wakes before sunrise, makes pancakes for Noah every morning, and somehow convinces an energetic little boy that pulling weeds together is more exciting than video games. Noah counts down the days until Grandpa arrives like other kids count down to Christmas. This trip was supposed to be special because my father had finally agreed to stay longer than 2 weeks after Rachel kept reminding him that he didn't have to rush back just because he was worried about inconveniencing us. So I filled out the guest registration form exactly the way I had done before, attached copies of his identification, submitted everything online, and forgot about it. 2 days later, my phone buzzed while I was leaving a meeting. The email subject line simply read, "Guest application denied." At first, I assumed there had been a missing document. Instead, the message explained that extended guest privileges were reserved for homeowners and that tenants were limited to short-term visitors only. It ended with a sentence that somehow felt colder than the Arizona air conditioning blasting through my truck. "Please make alternative accommodations for your guest." I read it 3 times because something about it didn't sound right. I had lived there for almost 4 years. I paid every fee, followed every rule, never missed a payment, never caused problems. I walked back through the HOA documents stored in my cloud folder and couldn't find anything mentioning different guest rights for renters. That's when I called the number listed beneath the signature. The woman answered with the same polished customer service voice people use when they've already decided they aren't changing their minds. Her name was Victoria Sloan, vice president of the association and chair of the architectural committee. Though she somehow seemed involved in every decision around the neighborhood, I introduced myself, explained that I couldn't find the rule she referenced, and politely asked where it appeared in the governing documents. There was a pause. Then she sighed like I had interrupted something more important. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "we found that extended guests connected to rental properties create unnecessary complications for the community." I laughed a little because I honestly thought she was joking. I said, "I understand that's your opinion, but I'm asking where the rule actually exists." Her tone changed immediately. "We have policies in place to protect homeowners. People who rent usually don't have the same long-term investment in the neighborhood." I looked out through my windshield and actually smiled because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My investment? My son was growing up here. My family spent every holiday on that back patio. My wife had planted fruit trees we planned to watch mature over the next decade. If that wasn't investment, I wasn't sure what was. I tried one last time. My father isn't throwing parties. He's a retired mechanic who wants to eat breakfast with his grandson. Victoria didn't hesitate. Then perhaps he should stay at a nearby hotel like everyone else's visitors. The conversation ended there because I realized I wasn't speaking to someone interested in rules. I was speaking to someone enjoying the feeling of deciding who belonged. My father refused to argue when I explained what had happened. He simply booked a furnished rental about 15 minutes away and smiled the same quiet smile he'd worn my whole life whenever he didn't want his problems becoming someone else's burden. That hurt more than if he yelled. Every morning, he'd drive over before sunrise with fresh tortillas from a little bakery he found across town, spend the day with Noah, then leave after dinner because technically he wasn't allowed to sleep under my roof. A week into his visit, Noah looked up from the breakfast table and asked the question that stayed with me longer than anything Victoria had said. "Dad, did Grandpa do something wrong?" I told him no. He asked why Grandpa couldn't live with us if he was family. I opened my mouth and realized I didn't have an answer simple enough for an 8-year-old or honest enough for myself. That afternoon, after everyone left for the park, I pulled the original governing documents out of storage instead of the digital summary the HOA preferred residents to use. Something told me the answer wasn't in the convenient version everyone read. It was buried somewhere people hoped nobody would ever bother looking for. I spent almost 3 hours that afternoon going through documents most people in our neighborhood probably didn't even know existed. The glossy welcome packet every new resident received was only a simplified summary. The real governing documents were scanned copies of the original declarations recorded with the county nearly 40 years earlier, complete with handwritten amendments, legal references, and enough dense language to scare away anyone without too much free time. Somewhere around page 19, after sections about drainage easements and utility maintenance, I finally found it. One sentence. Just one. Every lawful resident of the community, regardless of ownership structure or tenancy, shall enjoy equal access to common amenities, guest privileges, and recreational facilities as established by the association. I stared at it for a full minute before reading it again. Then I opened Victoria's denial email beside it. They weren't even close. She hadn't interpreted the rules differently. She had invented an entirely new one. Rachel walked into my office carrying coffee, took one look at my face, and asked, "You found something, didn't you?" I turned the monitor toward her. She read both documents quietly, then looked back at me. "She knows this is illegal." I nodded. "Or she never bothered to read the documents she's pretending to enforce." Rachel has always been the calmer one between us. Whenever I get frustrated, she starts asking practical questions instead of emotional ones. "So, what happens if you show this to the board?" I lean back in my chair. "Normally, they apologize, reverse the decision, and everyone moves on." She tilted her head. "And your face tells me that's not what you think will happen." I smiled without meaning to, because this stopped being about my dad the moment she decided to insult every family that rents here. That evening I started digging deeper, not because I wanted revenge, but because something didn't add up. People rarely become this confident unless nobody has challenged them for a long time. I requested archive meeting minutes through the resident portal. I downloaded policy updates from the last 5 years. I compared board resolutions against recorded amendments filed with the county. One by one, a pattern started appearing. There were little policy memos everywhere. Parking preferences, pool reservations, clubhouse rentals, guest parking. Most of them sounded official, but almost none of them had ever been approved through the process required by the governing documents. Victoria hadn't simply overstepped once. She had quietly built her own version of the HOA rulebook over several years, counting on nobody reading the original paperwork. Around 9 that night, my phone rang. It was my father. He asked if Noah had finished the model airplane they were building together. I told him almost. Then there was a long silence before he finally said, "Son, don't let this become bigger than it needs to be." That sentence hit me harder than anything else. My father grew up believing peace was usually worth more than pride. He spent 40 years fixing other people's cars, avoiding arguments, and teaching me that respect could solve most problems. But respect only works when both sides recognize each other's humanity. Victoria had looked at my father and reduced him to a category, not a grandfather, not family, just another renter's guest. After we hung up, I walked outside onto the back patio. Noah was chasing fireflies while Rachel watched from the porch swing. My father should have been sitting right there beside them. Instead, he would soon be driving back to a furnished rental that cost more than some people's monthly mortgage payments. That's when I remembered something I honestly hadn't thought about in years. The trust. My grandfather created it decades ago as a real estate investment vehicle. When he passed away, management eventually transferred to me. Over time, the trust quietly accumulated commercial properties, residential developments, and minority ownership interests across Arizona and Nevada. Most investments were intentionally invisible. We never advertised ownership because anonymity kept politics away from business. Our neighborhood happened to be one of those investments. Through a chain of holding companies, the trust controlled just over 56% of the development rights connected to the original master community. It wasn't something I ever used because I believed communities functioned best when owners stayed in the background. Until that night, I had almost forgotten the paperwork existed. I drove to my downtown office after everyone went to sleep. The building was nearly empty, except for a security guard who nodded as I walked in carrying a box of old legal files. Around midnight, my chief financial officer, Daniel Brooks, answered a video call looking half asleep. Either the servers exploded, he joked, or this is important. I held up 2 documents toward the camera. Remember the Canyon Ridge investment? He rubbed his eyes. The master planned community? Sure. How much control does the trust still have? He opened his laptop, typed for a minute, then whistled softly. 56.8% voting interest through the parent entity. Why? I smiled. Because someone running the HOA thinks renters don't deserve equal treatment. Daniel laughed, then stopped when he realized I wasn't joking. Please tell me you're not about to start World War III over an HOA. No, I answered calmly. I'm about to enforce the documents they chose to ignore. By 1 in the morning, 3 emails were open on my screen. The first went to the association's legal counsel. I attached the original declaration, highlighted the equal access provision, included Victoria's denial email, and politely requested a legal opinion regarding her authority to create restrictions not approved by the board or recorded through the required amendment process. The second email went to the property management company requesting every policy memorandum issued during Victoria's time as vice president together with documentation showing board approval for each one. The third email went to Daniel, asking him to prepare ownership records in case clarification became necessary regarding the trust's interests in the development. I copied every board member individually. I copied the community manager. And after thinking about it for a second, I copied Victoria herself. I wanted everything completely transparent. No secret conversations. No surprise attacks. Just documents, facts, law. I hit send at exactly 12:43 a.m. The next morning started quietly enough. Noah and my father were making pancakes in my kitchen because technically daytime visits were still allowed. Watching them laugh together almost made me forget the emails. Almost. At 8:17, my phone buzzed. It was the HOA attorney. His response was only 4 sentences long. After reviewing the governing documents provided, I find no authority permitting differential guest privileges based upon ownership status. The denial appears inconsistent with both the recorded declaration and applicable Arizona statutes governing planned communities. I recommend immediate suspension of enforcement pending formal board review. I read it twice before forwarding it to Rachel with the simple message, "Here we go." 20 minutes later, another email arrived from the property management company. They were unable to locate any board vote authorizing Victoria's guest restriction memorandum. In other words, it had never legally existed. Then the phone started ringing. One board member wanted copies of the documents. Another asked how long I had known. The community manager sounded nervous enough that he kept repeating, "We weren't aware. We genuinely weren't aware." Around lunchtime, Victoria finally called. The confidence from our first conversation was gone. "Mr. Caldwell," she began carefully, "perhaps we should discuss this privately." I looked out the office window before answering. I thought the policy was already settled. There may have been some misunderstanding. "No," I replied quietly. "The misunderstanding was yours. You thought nobody would ever read the rules." She was silent for several seconds. Then she tried a different approach. "Surely we can resolve this without involving attorneys." I almost laughed. "Victoria, you involved attorneys the moment you decided your opinion mattered more than the governing documents." She hung up without another word. By late afternoon, the board had scheduled an emergency executive session. Residents were already exchanging screenshots of emails on the community Facebook page. Questions spread faster than rumors usually do, because this time the evidence was sitting in black and white for everyone to read. My father looked at me across the dinner table that evening and shook his head with a small smile. "You know," he said, "all I wanted was breakfast with my grandson." I smiled back. "I know, Dad." Then I looked at the notification lighting up my phone. Emergency board meeting. Mandatory attendance. Requested. Something told me Victoria had finally realized this wasn't about a guest pass anymore. It was about every decision she'd made while believing nobody could ever hold her accountable. The emergency board meeting started at 6 o'clock sharp, and for the first time since we'd moved into Canyon Ridge, every chair in the clubhouse was filled. Some residents were there because they'd heard rumors. Others came because screenshots of the attorney's email had already made their way through neighborhood group chats. Victoria arrived 5 minutes late carrying a thick binder. dressed the same way she had the day she'd told me my father didn't belong in our community. Except this time, the confidence she'd worn like expensive perfume had disappeared. She didn't look angry anymore. She looked tired. The association attorney opened the meeting instead of the board president, which immediately told everyone this wasn't going to be a normal discussion. He spent nearly 20 minutes walking through the governing documents, the original recorded declaration, the approval process required for policy changes, and finally Victoria's guest restriction memo. Every conclusion landed exactly where I expected. The memo had never been authorized. It conflicted with the recorded declaration. It should never have been enforced. Then came the question none of the board members wanted to ask, but everyone knew was coming. How many other policies were issued the same way? The room went completely quiet. The property manager admitted they were already reviewing several years of unofficial memoranda to determine whether additional rules had been enforced without legal authority. You could actually hear people whispering behind me. Suddenly, this wasn't about my father anymore. It was about trust. Victoria stood up and tried to defend herself. She said she had only been protecting property values. She argued that homeowners deserved additional privileges because they carried more financial risk. Before anyone else could respond, an older gentleman in the second row slowly stood and said, "I've rented this house for 12 years. I've never missed a payment. I've coached Little League here longer than you've lived in this neighborhood. Are you telling me my family matters less than yours?" Nobody applauded. Nobody had to. The silence after his question said more than any argument could have. The board voted that evening to immediately revoke every unauthorized policy pending legal review, issue written apologies to affected residents, and begin disciplinary proceedings against Victoria for exceeding her authority. She left before the meeting ended without saying another word. I honestly thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Over the following week, attorneys became involved, insurance carriers were notified, and the association's legal expenses started climbing. Residents who had paid fines under unofficial policies began requesting refunds. The board's own investigation concluded that Victoria's actions had exposed the association to significant liability, and under the indemnification provisions, she could personally bear responsibility for a substantial portion of the costs resulting from actions taken outside her authority. Around the same time, Daniel called to let me know the trust's representatives had formally participated in discussions regarding future governance of the development. The focus wasn't punishment. It was restoring confidence and ensuring no single volunteer could ever rewrite the rules again. A few days later, I ran into Victoria's husband outside a coffee shop. We met only once before at a neighborhood barbecue. He looked exhausted. Before I could say anything, he sighed and said, "I didn't know she was doing any of this." I believed him. We talked for less than 5 minutes. I wished him well, and we walked away in opposite directions. Sometimes the people standing closest to bad decisions never actually made them. About 2 weeks after everything began, another envelope arrived at my house. Inside was a permanent guest authorization issued under the association's corrected policy, along with a formal letter acknowledging that my father's original application should never have been denied. I handed the card to him over breakfast. He looked at it for a few seconds, smiled, and quietly slipped it into his wallet without saying much. That was my father. No celebration, no victory speech. The next morning, he was back at the stove flipping pancakes while Noah sat beside him telling stories about school. Watching them laugh together in the kitchen, I realized that had been the only outcome I ever really wanted. The legal meetings, the documents, the investigations, those were never the reward. This was a grandfather who no longer had to check the clock wondering when he needed to drive back to a rental across town. A little boy who no longer wondered why family wasn't allowed to stay together. Looking back now, people still ask if I regret pushing the issue instead of simply paying for another Airbnb and moving on. My answer never changes. Rules exist to protect communities, not to divide them. The moment someone starts using them to decide who deserves dignity and who doesn't, those rules stop being about order and start becoming about ego. And ego has a funny way of collapsing under the weight of its own arrogance. I never asked for special treatment. I only asked that my father receive the same treatment every other family was already promised. In the end, the documents spoke louder than opinions ever could. But here's the part I still think about. If my family had quietly accepted that decision, how many other families would have continued believing they had fewer rights simply because nobody challenged the person making the rules? Maybe that's the real lesson in all of this. Sometimes standing up for yourself isn't only about you. It's about every person who comes after you. So now I want to hear your opinion. If you had been in my position, would you have let it go for the sake of peace? Or would you have challenged the HOA the same way I did? And where do you think the line is between protecting a community and abusing authority? Share your thoughts in the comments because I have a feeling this is one debate where people are never going to agree. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications because the next story might make this one look almost ordinary.